Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North. In a previous episode covering the murder of Ellen Higginbottom, it was stunning to learn that her killer had no propensity to perpetrate such a horrific act. There were no warning signs to imply that Mark Buckley would pose such a threat. However, today we will look at a case of another man whose whole life was punctuated with violence and a deeply rooted hatred of women. From an early age, there was something different about Gary. He was a hot-tempered child who had extreme violent tendencies, to which his brother and sister often bore the brunt. He also enjoyed starting fires. This behaviour was deemed to be so concerning that when he was just 8 years old, he was assessed by a psychiatrist. At this young age, he was sent to Baynard House, the children's wing of the De La Pole Psychiatric Hospital in Hull, where he would stay for a short time, once in 1982 and again a year later. A former employee who worked at the hospital described the facility as being a place for emotionally disturbed children. This was an appropriate description for Gary, who during his stay at the hospital continued to demonstrate disturbing behaviour, with it being implied that he had a split personality. Sometimes he was calm and civilised, before flying into inexplicable bouts of violence, with many incidents being targeted at other children in the facility. As he entered his teenage years, it was reported that while his mother was recovering from an operation, she was attacked by Gary with a metal post. She would not be the only person to suffer at his hands that year, as the 14-year-old also attacked a girl whom he tried to strangle, forcing her to the floor and striking her about the head. He would attack again just a year later. This time his rage was directed at the son of his foster parents, whom he attempted to strangle. Joining the army at the age of 18 didn't seem to help him manage his violent urges, with it being reported that while serving in Germany, he was reprimanded for theft and criminal damage. It was alleged that he had become enraged when Sonia, the UK entry at the Eurovision Song Contest, placed second. This upset him so much that he threw a television out of the window. Entering his 20s, Gary still presented dangerous and volatile behaviour, from threatening his housemate with a knife to another occasion where he apparently broke the fingers of someone he had caught damaging his car. He also attacked another man with a baseball bat. Gary was born and raised in the city of Hull, which lies on the east coast of England at the entrance to the Humber estuary, and it would be here that his violence would turn to murder. An article for Hull Live in 2019, written by James Campbell, explored the long and often contentious history of sex workers in the city. Hull's docks were a favoured haunt of sex workers, seeking to make a living from the many sailors who once arrived into the port. They made for eager clients, having been at sea for weeks or sometimes months. For over 200 years, councils, law enforcement and the courts have often taken action to discourage the activities of sex workers. In his article, James Campbell refers to a chief constable whom in 1885 attempted to cleanse the streets of Hull, stating, quote, "Houses, which were fearfully notorious for their disreputable character, have been voluntarily closed by their occupiers in Chapel Street and Little Queen Street." It was claimed that these properties were the social evil in Hull, and that they had been a social and moral pest for years. At the beginning in the 1900s, sex workers who had been operating on the docks would become targets of this cleansing. Their, quote, immoral acts were deemed to take place at a local public house, the Duke of York. As such, the decision was made to remove the pub's licence. These attempts to clean up the streets, as it is often referred to, seem to take place on frequent occasions throughout the years, but they do not seek to find the source of the issues that have caused women to take to the streets. Instead, they are moved away from areas that are usually locations that are becoming gentrified, seeking to hide away the darker aspects of the city in the shadows. During the 1920s, attempts were made to clamp down on activity on P Street in the city, which was an area that saw poverty and deprivation, as people lived in cramped rooms in back-to-back terraced houses. These houses also offered somewhere for sex workers and clients to meet. When authorities became aware of this, they took action, as James noted in his article, quote, "In November 1922, a scheme was laid out that would cleanse P Street." Another example of sex workers being moved on in the wake of regeneration, James highlights the cleansing of 1980, when the area around the Albert Dock was earmarked for redevelopment. By the 1990s, women were frequenting the areas around Walker Street, Porter Street and Osborne Street. These had become the city's new red light district, and were frequented by 3 women whose deaths I shall cover in today's episode. Regarding this new location, James Campbell quotes Councillor Hale, who had stated it was a major blight in Osborne Street. It was a particular issue for the residents in the high-rise flats. It got to a point where CCTV was installed, at a time when CCTV was not common, to deter the prostitutes. Councillor Hale did accept that this issue is part of a wider social and economical problem, stating, quote, "So long as there are drugs and poverty, there will be sex workers. Redevelopment and changing the road systems have helped move the problem on, but it just ends up elsewhere." Councillor Hale is correct that the issue cannot be resolved simply by just redeveloping an area. The reasons for why these women are on the street are a deeper societal issue that is complicated by issues such as addiction, unemployment and poverty. If these are not addressed, then sex workers can become trapped in a perpetual cycle of dependency. Sex workers have and are still considered to be people who live on the fringes of society, often looked down on and treated like their lives are less important. But for many of these women, they are not on the streets by choice, but by necessity. For the women in today's episode, they turn to sex work in order to support themselves and their families. Sadly, once they entered this world, they were also introduced to the dark side of abuse and addiction. On the morning of the 26th of October 1997, 3 schoolgirls who had spent the night at a sleepover headed to the local video store to return a film. After running this errand, they decided to take a walk alongside the River Humber. 2 miles ahead of them rose the steel superstructure of the Humber Bridge, the UK's longest single-span suspension bridge. It acts as a beacon welcoming people to the city. But the girls' attention was not attracted to the bridge that morning, as they casually strolled along the gravel path beside the river, busy chatting as they went. Their pleasant, carefree walk came to an abrupt end. At first, they were unsure what they were seeing, as it lay on a muddy embankment 33 feet away from the shore. But as they looked more intently, the 3 friends realised that the item was a body, lying face down, with short blonde hair caked in river debris, and bruising located on various limbs. Hastily, the alarm was raised, and police officers soon arrived at the scene. It was apparent in these early stages that this was unlikely to have been a case of accidental drowning, given that the individual was undressed from the waist down, her clothing lying discarded on the rocks around her. The victim had been violently assaulted, with injuries consistent with being stamped on, strangled, and her body having been run over by a motor vehicle. Detective Ken Bates, who was to lead the investigation, would later express his shock at the extent of the victim's, quote, "absolutely awful injuries." Early media reports stated that police were treating the incident as a sexually motivated attack, and confirmed that the individual had died from strangulation. However, at that stage, they had not been able to identify the deceased woman, and appealed for the public's help. DS Ken Bates told press, "She was naked from the waist down, which does give rise to a sexual motive to the killing. However, the results of forensic tests are still awaited. The outcome of the post-mortem examination revealed that death was due to strangulation. There are other injuries to the body, but tests are being carried out to establish whether they were as a result of the murder or because the body had been in the water, possibly bumping against rocks close to the water's edge. We do not believe they have been in the water for long, probably about 6 to 12 hours. This is a particularly vicious murder, and before the inquiry can progress further, it is imperative we know who she is and her last known movements." She was described as a white female aged between 20 to 40 years old, approximately 5 foot 4 inches tall, and of a plump build. Her brown, shoulder-length hair had been dyed blonde. It would later be revealed that the remains were those of 29-year-old Samantha Class, a devoted mother of 3 small children. She had fallen on hard times, and in order to provide for her family, she had turned to sex work. This left her vulnerable to the other trappings that come with working on the streets, with the young mum becoming addicted to heroin, which just a day before her murder she had stated she wished to stop her dependency for the sake of both herself and her family's happiness. Samantha never got the chance to turn her life around and give her children the life she really wanted for them, as within 24 hours of sharing this hope, she would be murdered. As 1997 came to a close and the new year began, police were struggling to generate any leads in the case, encountering apathy from the public, some of whom believed the police's time was better spent on other cases, while others, particularly those who operated in the red light district, were afraid to talk due to fear of reprisals. This left the investigation in a difficult position, especially when the body of another sex worker would be found in the city. In May 1998, the body of 20-year-old, red-haired Hayley Morgan was found. Like Samantha, she had been working in the red light district of the city and had also developed an addiction to drugs. Hayley had been missing for 2 days when her half-naked body was found in an alleyway, placed under a tree with a bag over her head. The location of her body, which was far from where she lived and worked, suggested she may have died somewhere else, and someone had moved her body. Despite this last detail, the coroner determined that she had died from asphyxiation caused by a drug overdose. But this didn't explain why she had a bag over her head. The incident was not considered to be murder. However, 4 individuals were arrested in the course of the inquiry. Police were eager to reassure the public that Hayley's and Samantha's cases were not related, with Detective Superintendent Quentin Dowes stating, "We are comparing similarities and seeing if there is any link, but at this stage there is nothing concrete to link the crimes, other than the fact that both victims were sex workers." However, just 3 months later, a third sex worker would be found deceased in the city, sparking speculation that there was a serial killer on the loose. Mum of 3, Natalie Clubb, was a friend of Hayley Morgan's. She had been reported missing in May of 1998 by her boyfriend Darren, and would be found in August that year. Unlike the other girls, Natalie's body had been dismembered, placed in black bin bags, and disposed of near a water pumping station in Hull. Palm prints and tattoos on the arms were used to identify the remains as those of Natalie. Once again, police were eager to downplay any ideas that there was a connection between the 3 deaths, with a police spokesman stating it would be wrong at this stage to speculate how Natalie died, or if her death is linked to other murders, going on to label any suggestions of a serial killer as, quote, pure speculation. However, this did nothing to quell the fears of the sex workers who operated in the city's red light district, who were convinced there was a killer targeting them, with one stating, quote, "We have no faith in the police. There's a serial killer out there, another ripper. Every girl I speak to is terrified they will be next." In the wake of her 25-year-old daughter's death, Natalie's mother Linda travelled from her home in London to place flowers at the site where her child's body was found. She also made a heartfelt plea to help in catching the person responsible for Natalie's death. At a press conference, she stated, "I have come to Hull today to appeal for help to find the person who killed my daughter. I have heard of Natalie's lifestyle while she was living in Hull. That was not the Natalie I knew and remember. Natalie was a loving daughter and mother who was totally devoted to her 3 children. She was always happy and we all loved her very much. Her death has left the whole family devastated. The person who did this terrible thing to Natalie must be caught. They cannot be allowed to get away with it. There has got to be people out there who know what happened to my daughter. I ask them to please contact the police for my family's sake. Only when this person is behind bars can our family begin to come to terms with what has happened." Apart from the 3 girls being sex workers and being reliant on drugs, The investigators were unable to pinpoint anything that could categorically confirm a link between the deaths, with each having differences in the manner in which they were killed and disposed of. The police continued to treat them as 3 separate incidents. By October 1998, a year since Samantha's murder, the investigation had failed to gain much traction in the case, leading Humberside Police to seek the assistance of BBC's Crime Watch UK in the hopes of generating new leads. Her mother spoke during the appeal, stating, "She is a mother of 3 children. She's also my daughter. I wish she wasn't a prostitute. I would have done anything to stop her doing what she did. I spoke to her many times about it, that something might happen she couldn't control. I was frightened for her. I was really frightened for her." A sex worker who knew Samantha told Crime Watch that Sam was one of those girls who never wanted to be a sex worker. She continued by recalling an encounter she had with Samantha and a man on Walker Street in the city at 9:30 p.m. on the 23rd of October. She recalled that the man's demeanour struck her as that of a man who didn't want to pay for sex, and treated Sam more like he wanted her to be his girlfriend, offering her a cigarette and implying he could take her to Spain. The witness noted that the man's cigarette box had foreign writing on it, and that he had a tan, which police theorised suggested he may have been to Spain recently. She described the man as being about 5'8" and in his early 30s, continuing, quote, "He was very thick-set, very broad, with a beer belly, double-chinned, quite broad neck. His hair was very short, micey brown, it was thin and receding." He asked Samantha for her name and address, which she provided, a practice the witness stated some sex workers did if they believed the person would be a regular client. When the man went to place the address in his wallet, the witness noticed he had a large quantity of banknotes. She stated, "He came across to me to be really possessive, the type who feels once he befriends a person, feels he owns that person to the extent that if they make an arrangement with him, they've got to stick by it." The witness then recalled that Samantha and the man walked off out of view. This would be the last time she saw Samantha. However, she would have another alarming encounter with the man the following day. On Saturday the 25th of October, Samantha spent the morning with a friend while her sons played in the garden. She captured a photo of her boys, and her friend took a photo of Sam, her big smile illuminating the last image taken of her before she died. That night, Samantha would be working the red light area of Hull, hoping to earn money to support her young family. She had a brief conversation with another sex worker while on Myton Street, just after 8:30, before Samantha headed off to another location on Porter Street. Not long after Samantha had left, a car pulled up on Myton Street and Samantha's friend got into the vehicle. Her disturbing encounter was dramatised by Crime Watch. She described that within a couple of minutes of getting into the car she became uneasy, as when the pair stopped at the South Boulevard industrial estate, she recalled the man became increasingly agitated and kept clenching his fists. He was rocking and became verbally abusive, calling the young woman a cow, slag and a bitch. When the man tried to grab her, she was able to leave the vehicle, fleeing across an empty car park, calling for help. Fortunately, a passing taxi stopped to assist her. Remembering the experience, the sex worker stated, "I've been on the streets 8 years, and I have never ever experienced anything like that. If he had got hold of me, I don't think I would be here today." At 11 p.m. on Walker Street, Samantha's friend would have another encounter with the man she had last seen Samantha with the day before. But this time he was very angry. He raced towards her and demanded to know if she had seen that, quote, "bitch from Firethorn," which was where Samantha lived. When her friend stated she hadn't and inquired why he was asking, he started to rant about the fact that Samantha had failed to show up. He stated, quote, "You're all the same, you whores, you working girls. One of these days you're going to get what's coming to you. You mark my words." His tirade was interrupted by the sound of an approaching police siren, causing him to grab Sam's friend by the arm and drag her into a secluded spot out of the sight of the road. He pushed her against a tree and stated, "Better safe than sorry, remember that. And forget me. Tell anyone who I am, mention a thing about me, I'll find you, I'll wipe you off the face of the earth. I'll find you and I'll kill you. The sex worker, shaken by the incident, and described the glare in his eyes as the look of evil. Upon hearing that Samantha had died, she believed the man she encountered that night was likely involved. 2 hours later, Samantha was witnessed getting into a vehicle on the corner of Porter Street and Osborne Street. Although police didn't believe this client was involved in her murder, they asked the man to come forward to advise where he had gone with Samantha and where he had dropped her off, in the hopes to further narrow down her movements that night. In the early hours of that morning, a security guard working in an isolated building on the outskirts of the city would be the next key witness. About 2.5 hours after Samantha had last been seen, the security guard spotted a white vehicle heading down Brickyard Lane, a single-track dirt road, which only led to the Humber Estuary, where Samantha's body was found. This lane was often used by walkers and cyclists during the day, and by night young couples seeking a secluded spot. Drug users and poachers had also been known to frequent the area. The white vehicle witnessed by the security guard was of particular interest, as it was heading towards the river at about the time police believed Samantha's body was placed in the water, after taking into account the current and the tidal nature of the waterway. If this was the perpetrator using this track, it suggested he was local, or he was someone with knowledge of the area, as it was not an easy place to find, especially at night. Following the reconstruction, Ken Bates appeared in the Crime Watch studio, where he called for other sex workers to come forwards, who may have been approached by the man who had offered to take Samantha to Spain. With regards to the placement of Samantha's body, it was pointed out that the individual responsible would have had to wade out into the estuary roughly up to thigh height, resulting in his clothing becoming sodden and coated in mud, which would have caused him to potentially return home in that state. At the close of the appeal, it was announced that a reward had been raised as an incentive for people to come forwards. A month after the appeal, it was announced that a man had been arrested in relation to Samantha's murder. This wasn't due to the Crime Watch appeal, or even the thorough police investigation. The man had been stopped under suspicion of driving while under the influence of alcohol. He was arrested and a sample of his DNA was collected. When the sample was processed, it came back as a match to DNA recovered from Samantha's remains. The man who had been arrested for drink driving was Gary Allen. Investigators' belief that the deaths of the 3 sex workers were unrelated was proven to be accurate, as within months of Allen's arrest, in April of 1999, Darren Adams was charged with the murder of Natalie Clubb. The man who had reported the mum of 3 missing was also the one who had ended her life. The murder allegedly occurred after an argument between Natalie and Darren, during which he stabbed her in the chest 8 times. He then went to a friend's house. This individual returned to the boarding house where Natalie and Darren were staying, and helped dismember the body in the bathtub before disposing of her remains near the pumping station. Appearing at Sheffield Crown Court in the year 2000, Darren was found guilty of murdering Natalie. As the verdict was read out, the defendant began a tirade aimed at members of the jury and the police officers that had investigated the case. He shouted, "You're all corrupt, you're as bent as them." His protest was silenced. He was later handed a minimum term of 20 years. He was due for parole in 2017. However, before this could happen, Darren Adams died while behind bars. The impact of his actions were expressed by a family member. A statement was read on their behalf following the news of Darren's death, relaying their feelings, quote, "We all believe Adams was an evil person. There is no 2 ways about it. He ruined many lives. Not only did he murder our mum, he chopped her up and threw her away in bin bags. Some parts were never found, so we don't even know what is in our mum's grave." Maybe some people who commit murder deserve a second chance, but not Adams. He was very cunning and even reported her missing himself. He blamed others for her death. Our mum lived a chaotic life, but it was only when she met Adams that she got into drugs. I am sure there are people out there who deserve to be killed, but not our mum. We were very young when our mum was killed, but I know she loved her children. She wasn't perfect, but she was never given the chance to improve and be the mum we know she could have been. She was a free spirit and enjoyed life, but she made one mistake in getting involved with drugs, and she paid a terrible price. If nothing else, we hope this sends out a message to other young women who may be getting involved in drugs. Our mum was very young when she died and could have turned her life around. Some people get into trouble all their lives. My mum had an 18-month period where she was involved in drugs and was killed. Samantha Class's family hoped that her killer would be brought to justice as well, and Gary Allen stood trial in February 2000, with Detective Ken Bates stating that they were confident that they had significant evidence to prove that Allen had committed the horrific murder. During the trial, Allen would take to the stand and advise the court of his version of what occurred on the night of the 25th of October 1997. He admitted he had driven to the red light district in Hull and had been approached by Miss Class. He proceeded to state that he paid her £30 for sex, but she had become angry with him when they discovered the condom had split. He explained that he engaged in an argument with Samantha, resulting in the mum of three exiting the car and walking away. He claimed that was the last time he saw her, and as far as he was aware, she was alive and well. It was also revealed that he had returned home in the early hours of the morning and was witnessed washing his clothing. He then proceeded to take his car to the scrapyard, just days after the murder. When investigators asked why he had decided to get rid of his vehicle, he told them he had seen a news report about Samantha and he didn't want to be accused of a crime he didn't commit. Having checked his claim, it was discovered that he had disposed of his vehicle prior to Samantha's identity being made public. Despite the investigators and the prosecution team being confident that they had definitive proof of guilt, the jury were unable to agree, and settled on a majority verdict of not guilty, allowing Gary Allen to walk free from court. Detective Ken Bates couldn't help but vent his disappointment in the verdict, stating, "I was disappointed for not only failing to get justice for Samantha, but also failing to get justice and the comfort of justice, closure for her family. But the main reason I was disappointed was that I knew that Gary Allen would go on to re-offend. He is a dangerous, violent man, and he wasn't going to stop." The detective would retire from the force just a few months after the trial, but his words would prove tragically pathetic. Due to the high-profile nature of the case, Allen was encouraged to move away from the city of Hull. He relocated 345 miles south to the town of Plymouth when no one was aware of his past. Here he was able to start a new life on Wyndham Lane in Stonehouse, which is located close to the dockyards of the port city, and the red light district was just 4 minutes' drive from his front door. It was here that his volatile nature would surface, just 6 weeks after him arriving in the Devonshire town. In April 2000, a 24-year-old sex worker was walking close to the junction of Union Street and Stonehouse Street when a man approached her. He was dressed in a blue coat, navy blue jeans and a pair of white trainers. He wore his long hair swept back from his face, and he appeared to have not shaved in a couple of days. There didn't appear to be anything untoward about this man, as the pair headed off to find a quiet spot, with him taking hold of her hand as a police car drove past to give the impression that they were a couple. His pleasant and charming facade soon slipped once they had found a private spot, and she had requested he pay her up front. At this point, his entire attitude changed. Before the 24-year-old realised what was happening, the man had his hand about her throat. She recalled, quote, "He was calling me awful names. It was just rage. He obviously wanted to hurt me bad, and I didn't even know why. He got me in a headlock and dragged me back, and I fell onto the floor. Then he was just punching me in the back of my head. He tried to put his whole fist in my mouth, so I bit him. He still carried on hitting me, and I just screamed, 'Someone help! Someone help!' screaming and screaming." Her cries for help were thankfully heard by a police officer who was patrolling nearby. As the officer approached, he was violently pushed to the ground by the fleeing attacker, who was able to use those precious seconds to evade capture. The sex worker considered herself lucky to be alive. Recalling that night, she stated, "I don't know where I got the strength from that night, but I was fighting for my life. I knew if I didn't get away, I was going to be killed." When she learnt the identity of her assailant, she found it hard to cope with the realisation of how close she had come to death. It prompted her to distance herself from working the streets. Feeling unsafe, she began to suffer from post-traumatic stress, including nightmares and flashbacks. Unable to manage her feelings, the young woman grew increasingly reliant on drugs and began to steal from shops to fund her habit. Having turned her life around and looking back on this time in her life 20 years later, she is just thankful she is still alive. She would not be the only sex worker who would be attacked by Gary Allen while he resided in Plymouth, as he would go on to attack another girl, whom he also grabbed by the throat, forcing her to the floor. He proceeded to strike the terrified girl about the head, before forcing his fingers down her throat. The violent assault continued as the attacker attempted to remove his victim's clothing. Just like his other Plymouth victim, the assault was interrupted, this time by a lorry driver who swiftly contacted the police. Allen was apprehended soon after by a police dog handler. The two attacks were linked, and Allen was brought to trial in December 2000, where he faced charges of assault, causing actual bodily harm, and indecent assault. The women who survived his attack bravely stood to testify against him. This time the jury would find Allen guilty, sentencing him to 5.5 years. Judge Jeremy Griggs told him, "The circumstances in which you threatened these two prostitutes on 2 separate occasions, pushing your fingers into their mouths to gain control of them, seeking to choke them, must have been terrifying in the extreme. But for the summoning of the police from a lorry driver who was nearby, who knows what might have happened?" The aftermath of his attacks sent ripples of fear and heightened vigilance throughout the sex workers in the area. As the news of Allen's past, including his acquittal for the murder of Samantha Class, began to circulate, and as his release date grew near, warnings began to appear on various online sites frequented by sex workers and escorts. His name and deeds soon made him infamous amidst the sex workers in the city. Allen was released on probation in 2003, following which he had made some disturbing remarks about women to his probation officer, who recorded Allen saying, quote, "I like to frighten them, I like to cause pain, I like to make them cry, I like blood, I like to hurt them, I enjoy it, it makes me feel good." He would also breach the terms of his release by consuming alcohol and removing his electronic tag in an attempt to go on the run. This resulted in being recalled to prison. While he was busy breaching his parole, an 800-year law would be reviewed. The double jeopardy law, which had protected individuals from being tried twice for the same crime, was abolished in 2003, meaning that should new and significant evidence be presented, an acquitted person could be retried. This is exactly what happened in the case of Julie Hogg, which I covered in episode 15. Investigators were certain that Gary Allen had murdered Samantha Class, and that he was likely to strike again, but they did not have anything that would warrant a retrial. Upon Allen's release in 2010, he moved to the coastal town of Grimsby, and Humberside Police wanted to assess the threat he still posed. The operation, codenamed Misty, would involve a number of undercover officers who would work at befriending Allen. One officer, who was given the name Ian, developed a relationship with Gary, and during one interaction, Allen began to describe how he'd visited sex workers, and had an encounter with one who made him so angry that he, quote, strangled her and dumped her in the Humber. This, along with other potentially incriminating conversations, had been recorded, and was sent to a court of appeals in the hopes it would be enough to justify a new trial. Having reviewed the audio, the decision was made that it was not compelling enough to overturn the original verdict, with the Director of Public Prosecutions, Max Hill, explaining the decision, quote, "In many of the early cases, it was an advance in scientific evidence that was the hallmark of a double jeopardy case. This is not one of those cases. And so, even with the undercover evidence confessions, it was necessary to put around that more evidence to satisfy the test of new and compelling evidence. Despite the obvious threat Allen posed to the public, particularly those who would be deemed high risk, such as sex workers, the police found their hands tied. Gary Allen would settle in the South Yorkshire town of Rotherham, and his freedom would once again bring about the death of another vulnerable woman. Alena Grilikova was born and raised in the Central European country of Slovakia, where she married and had 4 children. In 2008, the family moved to Rotherham in South Yorkshire, seeking better prospects and education for their children. The family settled into their new home, but within 5 years, Alena's marriage would dissolve, and she would separate from her husband and her children in 2013. Now living alone, Alena's life began to spiral out of control. Struggling to make ends meet, she turned to sex work, but this in turn led to her starting to use drugs, becoming caught in the vicious cycle of making money to get her next fix, while each night facing the dangers associated with being a sex worker. In Alena's case, it wasn't a random client that would end her life, but a man she had known for 3 months. Gary Allen had been heading to work in October 2018 when he met Alena at a bus stop. According to him, the pair developed a friendship and she would often visit his flat, and he claimed he used to lend her money. Alena was, however, determined to get her life back on track and had made plans to return to Slovakia. This goal was brought to an end on the 26th of December 2018 when she disappeared. Her absence was first noticed by her mother, who hadn't heard from her daughter, and when attempts by Alena's ex-husband to contact her got no results, he reported Alena missing. Detective Chief Inspector Mike Houghton would later admit that, quote, "This case was initially a missing persons investigation. It was complex, with many unconfirmed sightings reported. Concerns about Alena's relationship with others in the Roma Slovak community and fears of trafficking and exploitation. To start off, we didn't know if she had tragically taken her own life, been killed, or simply returned to her home country of Slovakia." Alena was known to frequent Parkgate, a suburb 1.5 miles north of Rotherham town centre, and it was here that police focused their attention, hoping to trace where the 38-year-old may have been in the days prior to her being reported missing. In total, they reviewed over 30,000 hours of CCTV footage, from which it became apparent that Alena had last been seen in the area on the 26th of December 2018. That evening, Alena had been to the Travellers' Inn on Broad Street, which she left at 7 p.m. with a man, who was later questioned and cleared of any involvement in her disappearance. At 8:30, she was sighted with a man on Scooby Lane, which is quite an isolated spot, located 12 minutes' walk away from the Travellers' Inn, and a preferable location for a sex worker and her client. It was noted that she had been heading towards Mungan Road, from which one can turn right onto Taylor Lane, primarily made up of industrial buildings. The lane is also the location of the Fitzwilliam Arms Hotel, where Alena would be seen at approximately 10:30 p.m. that night. She was captured leaving the venue and was last seen heading back towards the Travellers' Inn, where she had started her night. Despite the collection of CCTV from all available sources, a search of the area and 125 reported sightings, Alena seemed to have vanished. Over the next 4 months, unbeknownst to the police and the public, Alena's body lay around 234 feet away from the Fitzwilliam Arms Hotel. Vehicles passed on the road nearby. People shopped at the supermarket that backed onto a field where children would play. Between the field and the shop once flowed a stream, its banks steep and overgrown, making it virtually inaccessible. And it was here, in the dried-up weed-ridden streambed, as life continued around her, that Alena lay, undiscovered, until the 8th of April 2019. Police had become aware that Alena had disappeared less than a mile from where Gary Allen resided. When it came to light that he had known her, he was arrested for breaching his licence, which banned him from interacting with sex workers, or being in areas they were known to operate. Following his arrest, a search of his property revealed a treasure trove of evidence pertaining to Gary's deviant desires, including a mobile phone which had images of deceased women. This and other items were seized for examination, and resulted in a renewed search of the area around where Alena was last seen. This time a police officer, following the old stream, became acutely aware of the unmistakable smell of decomposition. A police statement regarding why the body had been missed in previous searches was issued, with a spokesperson advising an investigation would be carried out. The brief statement read, quote, "The area was searched in February, and following a review of all the search areas, it was revisited earlier this month. I fully appreciate there would have been concern among the public. I just want to stress the complexity of the investigation. This was not a murder investigation until April. 125 sightings had to be investigated. We had to look at CCTV of those sightings, house-to-house inquiries, visit witnesses, and so on. There was obviously a massive area to be searched around those sightings, so that area that was searched was one of many that had to be searched. It was part of that review that South Yorkshire Police unfortunately found Alena. She had been very well concealed in the stream bed. The Force's Professional Standards Department has been made aware. 2 days after the body was found, police confirmed what many in the area had already suspected, that the remains were those of Alena, and despite the post-mortem being unable to confirm a cause of death, they advised it was now being treated as a murder investigation. Upon the naming of Alena, her husband, William, released a brief statement, quote, "Alena moved with her family to Rotherham in 2008. She was a wife and a mother to 4 children. She came to Rotherham for a better life and education for the children. She separated from her family, which led her to leading a more chaotic and transient life. Although this happened, she was still a mother to 4 wonderful children, and she will be greatly missed by her family." Detective Chief Inspector Mark Orton, who had been assigned to lead the inquiry, told the press, "Our investigation into Alena's disappearance, and now the discovery of her body, is continuing to progress at pace. I can confirm that we are now treating this as a murder investigation. We have also arrested a 45-year-old Rotherham man in connection to the investigation. He has been arrested on suspicion of murder and is currently in custody, where he will be interviewed by officers." The man being held was Gary Allen, and police already had some compelling evidence against him. CCTV recovered from Allen's neighbours confirmed that Alena had been at his address on Boxing Day 2018, with her arriving at approximately 3:45. Investigators also obtained audio recordings from a mobile phone, which revealed the haunting exchange between the pair. The interaction was released by South Yorkshire Police.
"I understand fully well. You're taking me for a idiot, and I don't want you, and I don't want this. No, listen, get the out of my flat, or I'm going to chuck you out.
No like me.
Get out! Get out, that's it.
Okay.
Get out!
I'm coming here for you.
You can go for a walk.
How long? Please, Alan, please.
Goodbye.
Let me. No good me. Give me water. Water, please. No good me.
I don't give a
Give me water.
Get out of my life, Alena. I didn't ask you to come here. And you're a pain in the
Give me water.
No,
Please.
no.
You don't like it.
Get out. Stay out. I will throw you out if you don't get out of my life. I don't give a about you. You've come to my home and you've behaved like a stupid. I don't want you here. No. I didn't ask you to come here. I'm quite happy to be on my own for Christmas. I'll get out of my life. Go on. And Alena, if you knock on my door again, I'm coming out here and I'm going to beat the out of you. I'm not kidding. No, I'm not giving you all. I want you to off. Get out of my life. Get walking. Don't come back here again. Do not knock on my door again. Okay? If you knock on my door again, I'm knocking the out of you. It's that simple.
They believed that after Gary threatened to hurt Alena if she returned to the flat, he removed her from the premises and she headed to the pubs, where she would be seen on various surveillance cameras. It was speculated that Alena failed to heed his warnings, and after leaving the Fitzwilliam Arms, she went back to his address, unaware of how dangerous Alan could be. When she arrived, he flew into a fit of anger, during which he took Alena's life. While investigators continued their interviews with Alan, police approached the public for their assistance in tracking down some of the clothing that Alena had been wearing that night, including her sweatshirt with the slogan "Little Black Sweat" written on it, and her black tracksuit bottoms with white stripes down the sides. CCTV images suggested she'd also been wearing clip-on, blonde hair extensions, none of which had been located. DCI Orton spoke regarding this appeal, stating, "I do believe answers around what happened to Alena lie within the local community, and I'd encourage people to keep speaking to us if they have any information or concerns. Any information, no matter how small, could prove to be incredibly helpful. Officers are doing a meticulous search, looking for evidence that might be crucial to the inquiry. I do believe that the clothing could be in the local area, so again, just to reiterate the appeal, the top and black bottoms with white stripes down the side are still missing. This could well have been deposited in the local area. Someone could have found them. If you have found them, please get in touch." At this time, police also released a reconstruction of Alena's last movements, with an actress portraying her while wearing a replica outfit akin to the one Alena had been wearing. I will include this video, courtesy of South Yorkshire Police, in the show notes. While they were building their case against Alan, new developments the year prior would result in the overturning of his 2000 acquittal for the murder of Samantha Class. This was made possible by a High Court ruling regarding the case of Russell Bishop, who took the lives of Karen Hadaway and Nicola Fellows, two 9-year-old girls whom he murdered in 1986. When the case first came to trial, Bishop was found not guilty, but DNA recovered from the scene would later be matched to him. With the abolition of the double jeopardy law and this new compelling evidence, a retrial was proposed, which was accepted. The court also approved that the jury would be allowed to hear accounts of Bishop's behaviour post-acquittal. Karen and Nicola finally got justice when Bishop was found guilty in December 2018. This High Court decision proved crucial, as it allowed for Alan not only to be tried for Alena's murder, but to be retried for the murder of Samantha Class, with the jury being provided information regarding Alan's actions, including the Plymouth attacks, and his comments to undercover officers during Operation Misty. Gary Allen was brought to trial at Sheffield Crown Court in April 2021. Before a jury consisting of 7 men and 5 women. The jury would hear that Samantha Class, a 29-year-old single mother, left her 3 young children with a babysitter on the night of the 25th of October 1997 and made her way to the red light district in the city of Hull, where she was seen by a number of witnesses, including clients. However, the client who picked her up just before midnight would be her last. Samantha's partially submerged semi-naked body, which was sunken into the mud, was found just 10 hours later on Sunday morning by 3 young girls, with other items belonging to the deceased being recovered over the next few days. Post-mortem evidence presented to the jury demonstrated that Samantha had sexual intercourse prior to her death, and DNA recovered would match Alan. It was suggested that the transaction had taken place in Alan's vehicle, and this prompted him to dispose of the car soon after the murder. The coroner found signs of a brutal attack, with Judge Justice Goose later summing up these injuries during sentencing as, quote, "She had 33 injuries, or clusters of injuries to her head and body, external and internal bleeding, together with injury to her heart, spleen, liver, adrenal gland and kidneys. She also suffered multiple rib fractures. You attacked her with savage violence, including using a ligature to strangle her to death, and your car to drive over her. Finally, when she was face down and her heart had stopped, you drove over her body before disposing of her body in the Humber. It was a brutal, callous murder of a woman you thought had no value because she was a sex worker. It was noted that Alan was arrested due to a separate drink driving incident, which resulted in his DNA being taken, and this helped link him to the murder. However, he continued to deny any involvement and persisted on lying to investigators, insisting he last saw Samantha after she walked away following an argument. Because he admitted to having sex with Samantha, which explained the presence of his DNA, and the suggestion that someone else may have picked her up after she allegedly walked away, it left a shred of doubt, and despite strong circumstantial evidence that implicated Alan, the jury during the original trial were unable to find him guilty beyond reasonable doubt. However, the members of the jury in the 2021 trial were allowed access to new and pertinent evidence, including reports of his behaviour following his acquittal. Court was privy to information regarding 2 attacks on sex workers in Plymouth, which he perpetrated 6 weeks after he was found not guilty. Both these assaults occurred within a month of each other, and the 2 women were subjected to similar acts of violence. It was reported that Alan grabbed them by the throat and sexually assaulted them. However, he was disturbed on both occasions. It was surmised by Judge Goose that, quote, "It is highly likely that they both escaped more serious injuries, possibly worse." The jury learned that Alan was incarcerated for these attacks and was paroled on licence in 2003. During this time he was reported to have made several derogatory and disturbing comments regarding his thoughts on women, particularly sex workers. Probation officer Rosemary Parks recalled these comments, quote, "He spoke openly about his strong dislike for sex workers. He described them as being scum and the lowest of the low." Gary admitted to me that he planned and subsequently committed the attacks on the prostitutes in Plymouth. He stated that he targets sex workers as they go with anybody. Rosemary continued that Gary had told her, "The pleasure of hurting builds from the planning stage. Sex workers are easy targets. I just want to hurt people. Can't tell you how far. You know I can't tell you what I want to do to them. I enjoy thinking about it. I get pleasure from the thinking. I just really enjoy different types of violence." These damning statements were compounded by details from Humberside Police's year-long undercover investigation, which started in 2010, while Alan was living in the Lincolnshire port town of Grimsby. The operation gathered over 400 hours of covert audio recordings with the intention of gaining evidence that would confirm whether or not he was responsible for Samantha's death, and to assess the danger he posed to the public. With one officer advising the court, "We knew Gary Allen had a history of violence against women, so we wanted to give that shared commonality." Testifying anonymously in court, one member of Operation Misty described Allen as a loner and spoke of how they created a scenario that would gain Allen's trust, before enlisting his help disposing of bloodstained clothes, which he was told were connected to a crime committed in Holland. Discussing this ploy, the jury were told by one of the officers of a conversation which had occurred in a pub, quote, "Mr. Allen had been planning to do some work for me, in that he was planning to kill one of my associates abroad." During the course of that evening, Mr. Allen had turned round and said, "You don't have to worry about me, I've done it before." I stopped him and said, "You don't need to tell me any more," because he'd been drinking, and it wasn't the right time to discuss it. End quote. A recording 5 days after this conversation of a sober Allen was played to the court, in which he was heard backtracking on his statement in the pub. He now denied that he had murdered someone previously, clarifying that, quote, "I'm just saying violence and all that ain't a problem." A month later, he was recorded admitting that he had been involved in an incident with a sex worker, describing how he killed her and dumped her. "But that's just the way I was then. You know what I mean?" It was revealed that the operation came to an end when Allen was arrested and convicted for an attack on a sex worker in Scunthorpe, which resulted in his return to prison. Judge Goose would go on to praise the work of the officers involved in Operation Misty, stating during summing up, "The dedication and professionalism of those undercover officers cannot be overstated. Whilst it may have been insufficient on its own at that time to bring about an application to retry you for her murder, it has been very important evidence to bring about your conviction for both murders in this trial. Attention of the case then turned to the murder of Alena Grilikova, who had 4 children who were aged between 12 and 19 at the time of her death. The jury heard that the 38-year-old was experiencing a low point in her life. Following her being separated from her husband and her children, she became increasingly reliant on drugs and alcohol, turning to sex work to feed her addiction. It was noted that Alan had met her about 3 months prior to her murder, and Alena had spent time in his flat on numerous occasions, with Alan admitting that the two had engaged in sexual relations. They would drink together, and he claimed he gave her money. The jury heard that despite this unexpected relationship, which is told from Alan's perspective, he still harboured violent and disturbing thoughts, which was evident from the images and web searches he performed on his phone, with pictures of deceased women appearing to have been strangled. He also had conducted searches on how to commit the perfect murder. This does raise the question, had he befriended Alena for a more sinister motive? The events of Elena's last day alive were disclosed to the court, with it being reported that she had visited Alan's home, from where he forcefully removed her, amidst a tirade that was caught on an audio recording, which was played to the jury. It is not known exactly what occurred in Elena's final moments, although a pathologist would re-examine the post-mortem and determine that Alena had been strangled, which was consistent with Alan's previous attacks. The prosecution, led by Alistair MacDonald QC, put forward their theory on what had occurred on the 26th and 27th of December 2020. He told the court she was killed by Gary Allen either that night or into the early hours of the following morning when she returned to his flat. Mr. MacDonald proceeded by explaining that after committing the murder, Allen purchased hand towels and a pair of gloves which the prosecution claimed were for use in the deposition of her body. He conceded that there was, quote, no direct evidence to confirm that Alena had returned to Alan's flat, but he did ask the jury to consider, quote, those chilling threats about what he would do to her if she returned. You can be sure that Alena was murdered by Gary Allen. The manner in which he disposed of her body can only be described as incredibly demeaning, and only proved to demonstrate his deep-seated hatred of women. It was noted that he had also gone to great lengths to conceal the remains by covering them with grit and stones. Approaching the end of the trial, Gary Allen took to the stand to testify. He continued to deny killing Samantha and Alena. With regards to the former, he stated that the 25th of October 1997 was the very first time he had visited Hull's red light district, and he had told the jury in the 2000 trial he had picked up Samantha that night, claiming he paid her £30 for sex. He told the court that when the condom split, he alleged that Samantha had stated, "You better not have any diseases." He proceeded to claim that Samantha had asked him to drop her off, but he claimed that he was, quote, just wanting to go home, and so Samantha got out the car and walked away, off into the night. This was the last time he saw her. The defence counsel, Catherine Goddard, questioned Allen regarding whether he was responsible for Samantha's death, which he denied. He told the court his feelings regarding his interaction with her by stating, "I felt embarrassed, really. I felt ashamed of it. I just picked up a sex worker and had sex with her." He also claimed that getting rid of his car was simply a coincidence, and that he had done so because he needed to pay his rent. Reflecting on the moment he recognised pictures of Samantha on the TV, and realised that he had been with her the night she was murdered, he stated, "At some point I realised it was Samantha Class and thought, thank goodness I got rid of the car. It was a natural thought." The defence barrister asked Allen to explain why, when he realised that he had been with the murdered woman that night, had he not approached the police with information that may have been vital to the murder investigation. Allen told her, quote, "I don't trust them, and don't have faith in the system. I panicked. I just assumed people would put 2 and 2 together." After this questioning, the court was adjourned. with it reconvening the following day and Alan returning to the stand, this time to be questioned about Operation Misty. During his recollection of these events, he claimed that he had a feeling that he was being set up, and so he fabricated much of what he had told them. Alan did admit he did not suspect that they were undercover police officers, instead believing that they were people involved in the distribution of drugs, who were planning to rip him off. As he had done throughout, he denied that he had confessed to killing Samantha, and that his reference to previous deeds, such as burglaries and assaulting a police officer, were just part of his ruse, stating, "I was just talking out my backside. I just told them what they wanted to hear." His defence barrister, Catherine Goddard, repeatedly asked him why he made such false claims, to which he replied, "I just wanted to pass myself off as criminally minded." He admitted to helping burn the bloodstained clothes during the operation, which was staged in one piece of theatre for an undercover officer named Scott. He told the jury, "I was doing it more for Scott. I considered Scott as a friend, and Ian was his cousin." Mr. Allen told the jury he was just trying to big myself up to Ian. He said he still believed who they were and who they claimed to be, up until last year when he found out about the police sting. He continued, "I was pretending to be like them, and they were pretending to be like me, from what I've gathered." When it came to facing cross-examination, Alan explained that he had been, quote, "fitted up in a conspiracy, with the police and probation service being out to get him following his acquittal." With regards to the disappearance and murder of Alena Grilikova, Alan admitted that he had been friends with her and that they did have sexual relations. However, he was unaware that she was a sex worker. He spoke of what he claimed was their last interaction, which was recorded by his phone. He stated, "I didn't dislike Alena, she was a pain, and I wanted her out," going on to claim that he was shocked when he found out she was dead. The defence barrister, Mr. Goddard, asked him to explain what was the reason for his purchase of hand towels, a shovel, rubber gloves and wet wipes in the days following Alena's last known sighting. To which he claimed he cleaned his flat with wet wipes, and the spade was for an allotment he was thinking of acquiring. After a gruelling 8-week trial, the jury retired to deliberate. They would return 2 days later to find Gary Allen guilty on 2 counts of murder. At sentencing, Judge Goose summed up the case. He paid tribute to the families who had provided the court with impact statements, the judge stating, "It had been their opportunity to tell you, Gary Allen, what you have done to them. The profound and lifelong grief which has been caused to them by your wicked murder of their mother, their wife, their sister, or their daughter is almost palpable." Referring to Allen's actions during 2000, he stated that in addition to the offences in 2000 in Plymouth for attempted assault, occasioning actual bodily harm, and indecent assault, also you have convictions for breach of a sexual offences prevention order, 2 convictions for battery, and an offence of possession of an offensive weapon. The Plymouth offences are, in my judgment, aggravating factors of seriousness to count 2, the murder of Alena, which took place after those convictions. I find the following substantial aggravating factors of seriousness. First, that in both murders there was a significant degree of premeditation. Your mindset towards sex workers demonstrates that you had targeted your victims. Second, the substantial suffering that you caused Samantha Class before she died, borne out by the extensive injuries upon her. Third, what you did to Samantha in the short time after she died, when you drove over her body in your car. Fourth, your concealing of the bodies of both victims by disposing of them in the river and a stream, respectively. Fifth, your disposal of evidence, when you quickly sold your car to a scrapyard after killing Samantha, and equally I am satisfied that you disposed of the trowel and gloves you used to conceal Alena's body. 6. Your previous convictions for the Plymouth offences. The judge concluded by sentencing Gary Allen to a minimum term of 37 years, meaning he will be in his 80s before he is eligible for parole. Following the verdict, tributes were paid to both women, with Samantha's daughter Sophia stating, "Samantha was a daughter, sister, aunt and mum, a very loving mum. Sammy to her friends, caring, gentle and strong. For those who knew my mum, she was a million beautiful things. For the people who suffered after my mum's death, and most importantly for her, we finally have justice after 24 years. She imprinted on everyone's heart who met her. Because of Gary Allen, my mum violently and brutally lost her whole life, and our lives were turned upside down. Our family unit was broken into pieces, and so many memories as a family taken away in one night. I can never have my mother back. I have got to live with that, and there will always be a break in my heart. At least for us all, there are no more questions." A statement from Alena's loved ones was presented by her husband William, which read, quote, "The conviction for murder today is welcomed by family and friends of Alena both in the UK and Slovakia. The verdict will not reduce the pain and suffering that we have had to endure since Alena was so cruelly taken from us, but it does give us the justice that we hope to achieve." There was great relief that Alan had finally been brought to justice. However, given his propensity for violence and his hatred of women, question still lingers. Could he have been responsible for more assaults and murders? Given this concern, police forces around the country are now looking into unsolved cases to ascertain if Alan had committed more crimes. Before I end this episode, I want to mention the case of Hayley Morgan, who had been found dead in Hull in May 1998. The circumstances surrounding her death are still unclear. It is believed she died by asphyxiation caused by an overdose. However, investigators have failed to locate where she died and who had moved her body and placed the plastic bag over her head, and as such her case remains unresolved. Hopefully someday her loved ones will also get the answers they deserve. Thank you for joining me for this instalment of It's Murder Up North. The next episode is coming soon.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.